When we hear the word famine, our minds often jump to an image of natural disaster. We imagine parched earth and crops withered by ruthless droughts, an unavoidable tragedy where the rains simply refuse to fall. In this specific historical moment, however, the fields remained fertile. The grain was harvested in massive quantities. The food existed, yet it remained locked in warehouses while millions starved to death just outside the doors. The records show that specific legal decrees and impossible grain quotas emptied the Ukrainian countryside. Government policy, not the weather, ensured the food would never reach the people who grew it. This was a state-led operation so effectively hidden that the true scale remained secret for generations. Today, we look at the mechanics of a tragedy that occurred by design. To see how a country is starved through bureaucratic planning, we travel back to the 1920s. Our focus is Ukraine, a massive, fertile region in Eastern Europe that was known for centuries as the continent's undisputed breadbasket. Its soil, known as Chernozem, or Black Earth, is some of the most nutrient-rich dirt on the planet. Even in bad years, the Ukrainian earth yielded such immense agricultural surpluses that starvation here was virtually a mathematical impossibility. Yet, between 1932 and 1933, an estimated 3.9 to 5 million Ukrainians died of starvation. At the peak of the tragedy, around 25,000 people were dying every single day. How does the most fertile land on an entire continent run out of bread? The answer lies in Moscow, under the rule of the Soviet Union's dictator, Joseph Stalin. In the late 1920s, Stalin enacted a grand master plan called the Five-Year Plan, aiming to rapidly industrialize a backwards agrarian society into a global superpower. Building factories overnight required enormous capital. Stalin needed to buy heavy machinery from Western countries, which meant he needed hard currency. His only viable export to generate that kind of profit was grain. To control the exports, the state initiated a policy called collectivization. Independent farmers were forced to surrender their private land, their livestock, and their tools, and join massive state-run agricultural operations. Ukrainian farmers, who held a deep cultural and historical connection to their land, refused to give up their generational properties. They pushed back against the state's demands. Stalin frames this natural human resistance as a treasonous capitalist rebellion. He decided that this defiance had to be crushed at all costs. State media used the label kulak to target any peasant who resisted. While the propaganda depicted them as greedy hoarders, the definition was loose enough to include anyone owning a single cow or hiring an extra hand for the harvest. Stalin ordered the kulaks to be liquidated as a class. Hundreds of thousands of the most knowledgeable farmers in Ukraine were executed or packed into cattle cars and deported to the freezing gulags of Siberia. With the best agricultural experts removed, crop yields predictably plummeted. This animated chart illustrates the fatal mathematical trap. As agricultural production steadily dropped, Moscow did not lower the grain procurement quotas. They raised them. By 1932, the Soviet government demanded more grain from Ukraine than physically existed in the entire country. Moscow used these impossible quotas as a calculated snare to justify lethal extraction campaigns against the peasantry. When the collectives inevitably failed to meet these numbers, Stalin accused the peasants of sabotaging the state. Special brigades of loyal Soviet activists mobilized from the cities and descended on the Ukrainian countryside. As punishment for the missed quotas, their orders were to probe the earth, tear up floorboards, and extract every trace of allegedly hidden grain. The raids quickly escalated far beyond wheat. A new decree authorized the state to confiscate all sources of calories. Activists took the potatoes, the pickled vegetables, and even the planting seeds. They vacuumed the villages clean of anything edible. To guarantee absolute starvation, the government passed a draconian law, terrified locals called the Law of Five Stalks of Grain. If a starving mother was caught gleaning a handful of crop waste to feed her children, she could be executed by firing squad or sentenced to a decade in a labor camp. As hunger tightened its grip, the state denied internal passports to rural peasants, making travel illegal. The secret police completely sealed the borders of the Ukrainian Republic with roadblocks to ensure no one could flee to regions where food was still available. Confiscating non-grain foods and sealing the borders turned the famine into a deliberate method of extermination. These policies prove that the hunger was the intended outcome, designed to break the spirit of the people. The reality on the ground during the winter of 1932 to 1933 became known as the Holodomor, which translates directly to death by starvation. With villages entirely stripped of calories, people survived by boiling tree bark, roots, and leather belts into paste. In the most desperate corners of this hell, cases of cannibalism were documented. Wagons rolled through the silent streets every morning to collect the corpses. In some cases, drivers didn't even wait for the victims to expire. If a person was too weak to move, they were thrown onto the carts and buried alive in mass graves to save a trip the next day. And yet, while millions were dropping dead in the streets of Ukraine, the Soviet Union was actively exporting millions of tons of grain to Western markets. Society suffered a complete, excruciating collapse in the shadows, all while the USSR proudly showcased an image of economic triumph to the rest of the globe. The outside world largely ignored the tragedy. The Soviet states strictly censored all domestic reporting, denied any existence of a famine, and restricted foreign journalists from traveling anywhere near Ukraine. Western media was also complicit. Walter Duranty, the Moscow bureau chief for the New York Times, knew about the starvation, but dismissed the reports as anti-Soviet propaganda in his articles. He won a Pulitzer Prize while essentially serving as a spokesperson for the Kremlin. Because of state censorship and international diplomatic interests during the Great Depression, the truth was buried. It wasn't until half a century later, after the fall of the Soviet Union and the unsealing of KGB archives, that the internal documents finally proved the state's murderous intent. Today, dozens of countries recognize the Holodomor as an act of genocide. It stands as a chilling historical warning of what happens when absolute power is permitted to operate without basic human empathy or internal checks. The Holodomor reminds us that a government can choose to ignore the hunger of millions to achieve its political goals. By recovering the truth from these once sealed archives, we ensure that the victims of state-led violence are never entirely erased from our history.